Phrase more specific.
Okay, indicators. I guess everybody knows what indicators are, don't we? I mean, we've probably discussed indicators to death. Here are some, but I just want to clarify a few basic characteristics of them so that you understand what these great institutions like the OECD and the Commission believe them to be. Basically, we talk about, they have a number of different characteristics. The first one is that it's a variable, i.e. it's something that changes, yeah? It measures something, it measures achievement, yeah, or changes, yeah? So it's a variable that will change over time, subject to a number of different factors, yeah? It moves towards something, yeah, which is a target, yeah? So it invariably tracks the changes in that variable towards a target, yeah, usually based on a situation that was before the whole process started, which is your baseline, yeah? It informs, it's a tool for informing stakeholders about what's going on, yeah? So there it's important to emphasize this notion, the fact that it gives interested stakeholders the possibility of verifying if your policy or your action is actually going to be achieved. So it's a communication tool as much as anything, as much as a management tool, yeah? And it provides evidence that you've achieved something. So it supports this notion of accountability. You know, we know that we've achieved the results that we committed to because our indicators tell us that we've done that, yeah? So it's a tool that we can use for promoting as evidence for accountability purposes, yeah. And the final point is that it can be a qualitative or a quantitative measurement. So it can count numbers, but it can also talk about perceptions and changes, not just in terms of things that you can count, but in more sophisticated ways, yeah. So they're like the main elements of what an indicator or indicators are, and the kind of things that we would expect to see in every indicator that's defined. Okay, so that's the, so having spoken about what they're for and what they are, we'll now, I just illustrate the process that we go through when we're actually when we're defining, verifying, and using indicators. It's a number of different stages, but first of all, we look at the results chain to start with in a participatory way to check to see whether the results that we've got are valid and that we can work with that. Because once we've done that, we can then start thinking about the kind of indicators that we need to use to track the changes in that our intervention is going to deliver. Then we need to check to see whether we've got reliable sources of data, because it's all very well having nicely defined indicators, but if you have no data behind them, then you can't actually report on them, and then they're not much use to anyone. Then we need to put in place our baseline values. So we need to know where we're starting from, because if we don't know what we're starting from, it's very difficult to measure the kind of change that our intervention has actually delivered. Then we set the targets. Setting targets is actually quite a tricky business, and we'll discuss that in a little bit more detail in the following slides. Yeah. Then we validate the indicators in a participatory way. So we go and take it to our stakeholders and say, does that seem like a sensible indicator? Can we use this? Have you got data for this? Yeah. Are you comfortable with this target? And so on. And once we've validated it with our partners, yeah, then we can integrate it into our monitoring and evaluation arrangements. And then it becomes part and parcel of our performance assessment framework, to use a jargonized term, to basically say the way in which we're going to track up the way our intervention is performing. Okay, so there are the different stages that we should go through when we're setting up our indicators. Seems quite big, actually. I'm sure you're looking at it thinking, I'm not sure I did that, but you probably did. It just didn't seem like that in that schematic way. Okay, so I'm going to take you in the following slides. I'm going to take you through each of those different stages and just explain some basic principles about what a good indicator looks like, what are the main characteristics, and then how we can actually then start thinking about setting baselines and targets, identifying data sources, and so on. Okay. Okay, first of all, we start at types of indicators. Here there's a table, and it shows you the different types of indicators which exist. Yeah, on the left, we've got a title, and on the right, we've got a definition. We'll see that we have input, process, output, outcome, and impact, and in brackets, context indicators. These are all different types of indicators, and each indicator tracks a particular process or result or phenomenon, as we would say, to action, which is relevant to our intervention. So the input indicator measures the resources and means provided by donors and implementing parties. So that basically is like the amount of funds which have been made available, the amount of funds which have been contracted, and dispersed. So this tracks what's going on with the resources that we've got, yeah. And it doesn't tell us much more than that. And it's useful if you want to know whether the funds are flowing as you would expect, but it doesn't tell you much more than that. Okay, the next indicator are process indicators, and process indicators basically tell you that your activities are happening, or the things that should happen in your intervention are actually happening during implementation. Yeah, so these are linked mainly to the execution of activities. This means number of meetings held, number of training events that take place, and this kind of thing. Yeah, so this tells you that, let's say, the implementing partner has done all the things that they said they were going to do in a reporting period. Yeah, again, useful for tracking the actual the day-to-day ongoings of any intervention, but it doesn't really give you a lot of information above and beyond that. Yeah. So if you look at a project, I was looking at a project in Jordan last year. There, the output indicators were numbers of hospitals built. Yeah.
Yes.
Right. Now, as you can imagine, yeah, during the implementation, the 3-year implementation of this project, yeah, the value of that output was 0. Yeah. So as an evaluator, I went and said, you haven't built these hospitals. And they said, no, they're going to be built right at the end. Once we've commissioned them, then it's done. And then the value goes from 0 to 3 or 2. Yeah. And I was like, okay, so how do you know that you're actually on the right track? And it's, well, because we've got all of these process indicators which show us that we've committed, we've signed a contract with the subcontractor, that the subcontractor has actually started building the A&E ward, that these different this equipment has been purchased, yeah, that we've now got the medical supplies purchased, yeah, and it's all be ongoing. So this shows all of the different processes which are going on, so that at the end of the process, once those processes are complete, yeah, the output indicator will actually then be fulfilled because the hospitals are built and they're operational, they've been taken over and they're working, yeah. So the process indicators would tell you where the project is in implementing in its progress towards delivering those outputs. Yeah, so that's where process indicators are useful. Yeah, they'll tell you that, okay, because otherwise, if you just rely on the output indicator, you would say you haven't done your job because you haven't delivered your output. Yeah, because your output was a built hospital. So maybe that's a useful and easy way to understand what process indicators are, or how useful they can be. I mean, it's covered in the log frame under activities, really.
Yes.
I mean, yeah. I mean, but yes, invariably activities don't have indicators attached to them.
Yes.
So you would find these in this kind of action plan that Colin was talking about. Yeah. Yes. So it would be like, and this would be, you know, what you would find in quarterly reports from your contractor, where they'd say, you know, we've done this and we've done this and we've done this and we've done this. Yeah.
Yes, and some of them are kind of outputs, but if you want, I don't know if there's for 30 seconds, can I share a screen? I'll just show you this very quickly, visually. So let me just bring this up. Okay, this is the log frame for the PROMEL project. Okay, the whole thing, and capacity development is only one main component of it. So we've got an intervention logic, which we worked out actually in the inception period because the original wasn't so clear. Then we've got our log frame. And to be honest, I confess, you see we've overall objectives here, specific objectives, and so on. And then here we didn't have other outcomes. We went to outputs and so on. So there's 4 outputs for specific objective 1, and so on and so on. So all of these are, these indicators here are all result indicators, okay? Now, we stop here, and what do you find? Process indicators. We're now outside of the results framework as such. Now, very simple things. So we know, like, for example, the number of persons who answered our capacity development survey. what we're doing today was based on originally a survey of all delegations and so on. That was just, we wanted to know, that number of e-learning products that we have deployed. We don't consider an e-learning product an output. It's a kind of deliverable, but we still want to be able to say, we've done X. Okay, so it's not an output, but it's a process indicator, and so on. Okay, number of users who are certified to a level of competence who use e-learning products, and the same thing for other products. That's something which is very useful to communicate, but it's not sufficiently meaningful for us to really include in the results framework. Otherwise, we have too many indicators. So, we could go on like that, but a few of these process indicators are used to build, if you like, the values for one or two result indicators, but that's only in a few cases. In general, these are simply management useful information, which especially in the early parts of the project are very useful for me to be able to report, you see? Because some of the output indicators, it takes a long while before we really have a changed value coming up, even at the output level. You see?
I think.
Clear?
Thank you very much.
This box, you can see that they're in these two indicators are in a red box, and they are, and below them we've got three other different types of indicators, and they're in a green box. The green box are results indicators.
Yes.
So when you want to know what results you're getting, then you should be very interested in your output indicators, your outcome indicators, and your impact indicators. If you're interested in the implementation, then you're looking at your process indicators. They themselves are not results. They're just telling you if you're moving in the right direction towards getting your results. That's the distinction. And as Colm said, I doubt Enrique's interested in the process, but he's very interested in the results. And I think that is an important message. You don't go showing your big boss a load of stuff saying, oh, guess what? The contractor ran 15 meetings last month. He's like, what's that got to do with me? So we need to understand who our audience is, and those indicators will then we'll use those indicators for that specific audience. Okay, so the output indicators basically signals the degree of achievement of the direct products or services by an activity or set of activities. That means it tells us whether the things that the project said it was going to put in place have been put in place or not, or how close we are to doing that. I mean, they tend to be quite binary. They are there. It is there. The hospital has been built. The capacity has been increased by, 250 people have been trained. The IT system has been installed and is now working. This kind of thing. So that's an output indicator. Now the outcome indicator is more sophisticated, because this should signal whether the change that we've set out to achieve with our target groups is happening or has happened. So here we can talk about, and this is where it's important to try and understand the extent of the change that we're looking to achieve, because the outcome indicator should be able to tell us that. When you think about the fact that outcomes are generally changes in a particular state or circumstance of our target group, that means that we have to first of all understand what the state of our target group is prior to our indicator, before our intervention started, and then the indicator should somehow track how that change is happening, which makes outcome indicators quite tricky. So we'll come on to that once I've completed this. And the final set of indicators are impact indicators, and these signal whether the changes which we've set out for our final beneficiaries, those kind of wider changes, are actually taking place. There's also, I put in there context as well, and context indicators are even higher, and these do generally talk about phenomena which are occurring outside of the scope of the project as such, but these are related to, for example, socioeconomic developments, environmental issues, or even security issues. So indicators which indicate changes in that external environment, which may impinge in some way on the overall success of our intervention. They could relate to sustainability of our results, for example. Okay? Any questions, or can we move on? Okay. We'll go. Okay, there are two different, another way which we can categorize indicators are qualitative and quantitative indicators. Quantitative indicators are things you can count. Yeah, these measure achievements in terms of volumes or amounts. Yeah, they are objective facts they can count. They are numerical. Yeah, so they're often measures on a scale. So they're typically numbers or percentages. Yeah, and they're very common. In our experience, they constitute like 90% of all indicators. Yeah. And there's a good reason for that. I think because they're basically relatively easy to report on. Whereas the other type of indicators are qualitative indicators. These measure the quality of a result. Yeah. So the nature or the character of the change which has happened, or the nature of the quality of our output. Yeah. So these include opinions, perceptions, or stages of system development. Yeah. And so therefore they can be subjective. Yeah. So it's where we go and ask people, you know, what's it like living here? On a scale of 1 to 5. 1's rubbish and 5 is great. Yeah, and people will say it's about 2. Yeah, and so then once our intervention is coming in, let's say it's an urban regeneration program. Yeah, then you go back and afterwards you ask them, so what's it like living here now? And they'll say, well, it's 4 because things have got better. Yeah, of course you can then turn it in. So you then turn it into a numerical value, but it's still a perception which is being captured by that numerical value. And because of that, because qualitative indicators capture that perception of a change state, they are well suited to tracking outcomes. Okay, so there we go. So there's some examples of kind of what qualitative and quantitative indicators look like, and they're complementary. And we would strongly advise that you try to mix, so that when you're designing your indicator, designing your indicators, you should be thinking, is there a possible qualitative indicator that I could include in here, particularly for my outcomes or maybe my impact? So if you're talking about, you know, children are in safe and protected environments, you might want to be asking families or children themselves, how safe do you feel now? Yeah, this kind of thing. Yeah. Okay, so there we've got, there's some examples there, but I won't dwell on them because we don't have a huge amount of time, but the message is clear. Think about a mix whenever possible, particularly for your outcomes and even for your impacts. Okay, how to formulate indicators properly. There are a few basic ground rules that you want to bear in mind. Yeah, the definition. First of all, when we're putting a definition, yeah, it's nothing more, yeah, than a description of the unit of measurement and what is being observed. Yeah, so it's the thing we're going to measure. Yeah, so like a percentage of, yeah, and the thing that's being observed, a percentage of people trained in a particular skill, for example. Yeah, the indicator must be neutral. Yeah, so it's there to signal a change, but not the direction of the change. Yeah, the direction of the change is actually captured in another element of the indicator. Yeah, and that is our baseline and our target. Yeah, it should not include the target. Yeah, so the definition should say nothing about whether things are going to be increased, whether it's going to be 20%, and so on. It should be neutral. And especially if you're looking at small values like 0.4%, yeah, you wouldn't use a percentage to actually measure the change. So a 10% change in a value of 0.4%, that doesn't really mean very much. Yeah, so be careful when you use using percentages. You can use them in big numbers. So for example, a 25% increase in, I don't know, usage of public transport, that's fine. Yeah, but for small values, avoid them. Okay, here's a bit of an example. So number of implemented measures defined in the Public Internal Financial Control Action Plan. There you go. It tells us what we're measuring. Yeah, so the implemented measures as defined in an action plan, and the unit of measurements is the number of these things. Yeah, it doesn't contain any reference to a target or the direction in which we expect the indicator to move. Yeah. So for example, if there's a bad one, reduction of the number of accepted lawsuits and annulled decisions of the State Audit Commission. So there we say reduction in the number. So immediately we are infecting the definition with some kind of direction. Percentage of one-bidded tenders in electronic procedures is less than 25%. There again, we have a target included in the definition, and we don't want that. And finally, there we have a 3.5% increase in gender-based violence cases reported with a baseline of 25. So a 3.5% increase in 25 is, I'm not very good at maths, but it's not a lot. So you'd probably talk about an actual increase in the number of cases reported. Yeah. So there we've got some examples of what constitutes a good indicator definition and what doesn't constitute a good indication definition. There's a few examples. I won't dwell on this, but here in these boxes you've got result statements, and on your right are some indicators which have been added to them. This is taken from a real example in your neighbouring country to the south, i.e. Armenia, it's been a little bit adjusted, but you can see that in the outcome indicators there's a mix. So we're talking about numbers of public consultations, and then numbers of civil society organisations actively involved in these public consultations. And then we talk about the extent to which consultations are fully inclusive and deal with relevant policy issues. Yeah, and a really important issue when you're defining an indicator is to make sure that it's responsive. Yeah, that means that it should respond to the result that it's measuring. Yeah, and I've got here just a little illustration of what I'm talking about here. If you look at the first example, the result is increased road safety in municipality A. Now, you've got three possibilities there of the indicator that you could pick, and each one of them is kind of plausible, yeah. But in reality, only one of them is fully responsive to that particular result. So I just ask you, which one of those three do you think it is? A, B, or C? C, and C is the right answer, because that tells us if it's safer, because the number of accidents that are on the rehabilitated roads. Yeah. So this will show us. That's not to say that A and B are not plausible indicators. They're just not as responsive to the result as indicator C. Yeah. So I mean, what you've got is a road which might actually be an old road, yeah, going through the middle of a town, yeah, which causes massive traffic problems in the centre of the town. It has an environmental impact. It has a safety impact because people get knocked over, or there's lots of accidents on the road. Yeah, and it also might have a wider economic significance, i.e., nobody wants to live in this town, so the value of the housing is low, and there's no businesses there, and so on. Yeah. So when you rehabilitate the road, it can have a number of different dimensions to it, and one of them would be increased road safety, but it wouldn't be the only reason. I mean, it could also be that you wanted to, I don't know, reduce journey times or reduce the volume of traffic in the city, or whatever. Yeah. But this is one of the dimensions of your results, yeah, which you would get, yeah. The second one is about the improvement in the quality of life of residents living in a location, and there we've got three possibilities. Number of parks built, that's plausible, but it wouldn't really tell us that, you know, people are living better. The third one is income levels of residents in location B. Okay, people have got more money than they had at the start. That also sounds nice, but we all know that money isn't everything in terms of quality of life. So the second result there is perception of quality of life amongst residents. Yeah, that would tell us whether the people living there feel as though their quality of life has improved thanks to our particular intervention. Yeah, and the way that's a qualitative indicator, as you can see, and one of the way in which you would gather this information would typically be by running a survey in the location prior to you actually starting your project, yeah, and then tracking it over time or at the end of the project and asking people, okay, what's the quality of life now like? And that will allow you to then track the change. Yeah. Just want to highlight some of the good practices, some examples of good practice when you're defining indicators, and this is something that Enrique touched on in his introduction. When you're setting your indicator, you should certainly, for your outcome and impact indicators, especially at a contract or project level, you should be looking at your EU results framework, because they contain a number of indicators which may be relevant to your results. Bearing in mind the previous slide about responsiveness, it's all very well selecting an indicator from the EU results framework, but you should only do that if it responds to your expected results. Yeah. So make sure that you pick an indicator which will tell you whether your results have been achieved or not. There are also the Sustainable Development Goal indicators, and there are also sectoral indicators available from DevCo. And I know that there's actually a lot of subtle indicators out there. And I think really what we would encourage you to do is to do some research and to find out what are those indicators that maybe in the case of the EU Results Framework are strongly recommended. And then there are others which maybe are not obligatory or come from the Commission, but which you can also use to track some of the higher level changes within your impact level, which would then allow you to track performance. There's an obvious advantage in that, and that is that usually somebody else is gathering the data for you, which means you don't have to go out and gather the data yourself. Just a few other points which you should bear in mind. A good mix of qualitative and quantitative indicators. I think we've already discussed that. At least one indicator per result statement. That seems pretty obvious. You wouldn't have a result without an indicator. That's not allowed anymore. But the total number should be reasonable for monitoring and reporting. I mean, we say less is better. What I would say is that if you give yourself one result and 12 indicators, which is a case that I saw a couple of weeks ago, you're going to be spending a lot of time reporting on those indicators. If you've got 25 or 30 results or 30 outputs, and you've got 2 or 3 indicators for each output, then you're going to have to report on 75 indicators, and that is a lot amount of time, and it really is disproportionate to actually what you are wanted to actually track. Yeah, so it should really be proportionate. You know, use common sense, pick the most responsive indicators, and don't overload yourself with loads of indicators. Yeah. Disaggregate your indicators as relevant by gender, age, minorities, disabilities. Yeah, wherever possible, disaggregate. Yeah, so make sure that the data that you're reporting on, yeah, is available. So you can say the number of men that have been trained, and the number of women that have been trained, or the number of children, or the number of youth under the age of 24, and so on. You've got this data available to you, so you can then report on it. Final point: ensure validation of indicators in a participatory way. I know, because I've worked in delegations and I've worked for other organizations where you've been told, let's get this action document or this contract done, so fill in the log frame. So you sit down there on a Friday afternoon and you just write down whatever you can, and then you send it off, yeah, because you haven't got the time. However, that means that you can put stuff in there, indicators, which, you know, you will need your national partners to provide you with data about, yeah. And if you don't consult them on that, they could look at you and say, you know what? We haven't even got that information. We can't give you the data on this because it doesn't exist. But you've put it in there and you didn't talk to them. So really, it's crucial to talk to your partners. I mean, I had a great example not so long ago in Turkey. Lovely indicator, number of accidents on the rehabilitated railway line. I went as an evaluator and I said, okay, great. How's this indicator going? And they said, we can't track it because we don't actually keep statistics on the number of accidents on this particular line of the railway. And I was like, why did you put it in there? And he said, well, DG Regio told us to put it in, so we put it in. I said, didn't you ask the Turkish railways? And he said, no, we just didn't have time. I was like, okay, great. You know, so these kind of practical things, if you talk to your counterparts, they'll tell you whether your indicators actually make sense or not. So I strongly advise you to do that. Okay, next point that I wanted to make is identifying data sources. So what you should do, and I've just highlighted on this, is that you should make sure that there's data available for you so that you can report on your indicator. So ideally use something that already exists. And if it doesn't exist and you really still want your indicator, you want to use your indicator because you like it, then you'll need to create that data. Yeah, and this is usually done like within a project. This is done for output indicators. So usually it's like, you know, the implementing partner will report on what has happened and where they're moving towards. So that's data that you can use to track progress towards outputs. Yeah, and once you've picked your source, stick with it. Don't change it. That seems self-evident, but that does happen from time to time. So pick your source and stick with it, and try and stay with one source. I've seen indicators which offer 2 or 3 different sources. Yeah, which, you know, isn't really a very good way to go about it. Like, after 6 months, we'll pick that source. And after 12 months, that it looks as though things aren't going well, but actually we can look at this other indicator and that'll tell us that it's going better. So we'll use that one, you know. Pick one source and stick with it. Yeah. And yeah, I think that's the main point there on sources. Okay, the next important dimension of an indicator is the baseline value. Yeah. This tells us what the situation is before our intervention starts. Yeah. The baseline does not change during implementation, although again I've seen it where the baseline has been changed. You should set the baseline as close to the start of the intervention as possible, but of course we recognize that it might not always be possible to do that, so you pick the time which is close to when the project or your intervention starts, and that's your baseline. Yeah, you should state the period, yeah, when that baseline comes from. Yeah, the indicator baseline and target should be coherent. That sounds evident, yeah, but it's like you don't say percentage of women trained, and then your baseline is like 15, yeah, and then that your target is enhanced skills and capacities. Yeah, that doesn't make sense, but sometimes it happens. So the indicator, the baseline, and the target should be coherent. Yeah, you should also take into account how often you can get the data to track the progress before you pick it. So you don't pick a census, for example, because that's only done once every 10 years. So you probably don't want that. And in your baseline, if possible, include disaggregated data as relevant. Okay. So what happens if you've got no baseline? You can't get the data. If you don't set your baseline, you can't report on your results. No baseline, no results. It's really that simple. Yeah. Now I know that sometimes you need to put a 0 in there because, especially for outputs, yeah, you're putting in place things which weren't there before. So for the baseline, you can talk about 0, like kilometers of reconstructed roads. Before we did the project, there was no reconstructed roads in this area, and so at the target value, there you go. You can put 0 in because the target will be like, I don't know, 75. Yeah, so that's pretty simple. Yeah, but when you're talking, but you still have to state 0 because there could be somewhere else a bit of reconstructed road. Yeah, but you still have to state that it's a 0 or it's 5 or whatever, because that's then you know where you starting to measure from. Yeah, but in the case of outcomes in particular, yeah, where we're talking about change state, yeah, you have to make it clear that this is the situation that we are at the start of our intervention, because only then can we then assess the scale of the change that our intervention has achieved, yeah, thanks to what we've done. Yeah, and this is crucial. So 0 baselines for outcomes are basically not really feasible. You need to think about what the state of play is, yeah, in your target groups prior to your intervention starting. I can't emphasize that point strongly enough.
Yeah, and I think in the areas where you've been working, you know, the current projects and programs that you're developing, these are not starting from 0. You know, these are the next phase in a change process that has been running for some time. So in situations like that, we would definitely expect that outcome indicators especially do have a value for the baseline, which is not 0.
I certainly hope not, yeah. Okay, identifying targets. This is the second bit of that paradigm. So targets tell us how much change is expected and in what direction. So this addresses the issue we were talking about before. Where do you put it in the indicator? Well, you actually put that direction or that level of change in your target value. Yeah. So your target values are set at a particular period. So your outputs should be achieved. Your targets for your outputs should be achieved towards or at the end of your intervention, because once the implemented partner's finished, they're not going to be giving you any more outputs, that's for sure, unless you give them more money. Yeah. At the end of the intervention and afterwards, that's when your outcomes and your impact targets should be set. So if you set an impact target and it's the same as the date for the completion of your project, it's probably not correct, because those impacts will only appear 2, 3, 4, 5 years after your implementation is finished, and your outcomes will be appearing towards the end of your implementation and afterwards. So typically an outcome target will be 12 months or 18 months or 24 months after the implementation of your project, because these changes these are short to medium term changes, and they will happen only once the outputs are in place. Okay. And when you're setting your targets, you look at past trends, you look at the risks and assumptions and say, is this target feasible? Are there risks there that could stop us from achieving these targets? And you look at your baseline as well. It's like I say, this is where we are now. What can we realistically expect to achieve by the end of the project, or 2 years after the end of the project? That actually then makes it very important to set your target, which is sufficiently ambitious, to convince your bosses to sign off on it, but at the same time sufficiently realistic for you to be able to achieve them. We discussed the accountability ceiling yesterday. This is where setting your targets becomes important, and it's also not a technical discussion, because very often it becomes quite a political discussion, because people will say, we expect you to achieve all of these things with the money that we're giving you, and typically the beneficiary or whoever it is, the partner organization, would say, we're not sure that's reasonable, maybe we want it lower. So it's not really a technical discussion setting targets, it's actually a subject which is based around dialogue, so discourse. So again, it's a participatory process. Setting indicators and setting their targets should be done with your partners so that you can agree on what can be achieved by your intervention. Okay. What you should do, I think you need to state in your programming document as much as possible, what that current value is, where you put it, I guess is if you want it before things start up, you put it into the log frame as latest value. That's fine. If you update your baseline, that's also possible, but that has an implication for your target as well, because if the pace of change has increased over those in the intervening 18 months since the original baseline was set and the project implementation starts up, that may mean that your target may seem unambitious, and then you might have to change your targets. I suppose what I'm saying is that there's no hard and fast rule for this. I think ultimately you need to apply common sense to these things. Setting a baseline is important. If you need to update it, that's fine. Do it but you need to do it again in communication with your partners. Get the agreements of your hierarchy, and finally reconsider the situation with your targets, because it may have an implication for what you can realistically expect to achieve. It's a tricky one because the time lag in the programming process is such that this can occur. I can't help you any further than that. Just one final point though is about the final button is the use of intermediate targets. Set milestones, especially for outputs, especially for outcomes and impact, because these processes can take time. And if you just set a target value of whatever it is in 2025, and your starting point is, that means you've got to wait 5 years, to actually find out whether you've achieved that target value. So it makes sense at least halfway through. So like set a milestone, which is like, I don't know, whatever it is, half of the target value for like 2022 or 23, because then you can go and check to see whether we are moving generally in the direction we expect to achieve this outcome or this impact. Okay. Ultimately, what we'd say is that it should be evident from the analysis which is presented in the context analysis. So you should have a robust context analysis in your programming document, whether it's whether it's a description of action or whether it's an action document, which explains in clear terms, this is the situation as we see it. These are the problems that we face, and these are the solutions which we think are realistic. And based on your context analysis, then and the risks and assumptions which underlie, which exist in any intervention, you then set your target value. I think this is crucial, and this also it links also to the number of results which you actually set out to achieve. be realistic, and that realistic assessment comes from a really robust, realistic analysis of the situation as it stands. Yeah, that also links to your risk analysis. You know, if you can't deliver this, if the risks are so great, yeah, in the programming environment, then maybe it doesn't make sense to actually commit to this level of change because it's just not feasible. It all comes from a robust and solid context analysis. Colm, I don't know if you want to underline that, but this is something which I think is really important.
Yeah, I mean, the baseline, we've got to be able to see from the context, you know, where it's coming from. And in some cases, to be honest, it's not always clear at all, okay? So the question, especially if you've got a phase 2 or phase 3 of a previous action, the key question always is, you know, for the new phase, like what is the starting point? What has gone on before? What are the changes in the context that have taken place? And as Nina's also mentioned there to some extent, you know, what are almost some of the changes that seem to be in the pipeline and going automatically, you know? But another point, if I can just add on to that, which replies to what Nina had mentioned, which is in your outcome targets, well, and remember what an outcome is, it's not under your direct control. So that means there are other factors that can influence it. You directly influence it, but you do not directly cause it, and you do not exclusively cause it. So it is the case that maybe a target, especially at outcome level, or maybe a value can move even if you frankly disappeared into thin air. That certainly is the case. But when you set your target, you've got to be thinking of the change process, and you've got to be thinking, well, how much of this is going to happen anyhow, and how much is really additional due to our influence. So you've got to think of the dynamics of change and evolution. Okay.
Okay, we're nearly at 10 o'clock, which leaves us with very little time for our exercises. I just want to show you at the end an example of what a good indicator contains. And it's here. There you see the title, yeah, which is percentage of women in senior positions in trade unions. Yeah. And then next to that, there's a definition which explains in a bit more detail what is behind that indicator. So it tells us that we're talking about the percentage of women in senior management positions in a trade union, which are a public sector trade union, okay? And senior position is defined by the schedules or the personnel policy of the trade union, yeah, and is at least a head of unit post, okay? So there it's clear we know we're talking about a percentage, and we know what we're counting, yeah? So that meets the two basic criteria of our definition, yeah? And then we've got a baseline value, which is 15%, and the year, which is 2019. We have a target value of 25%, yeah, that's 2025. And we have a milestone, an intermediate value, an intermediate target, which is 20% by 2023, yeah. Next to that, we have sources of information, yeah. So the sources that we'll use for this are the trade union report, and the Department of Statistics within the trade unions is the source of the data, the generator of the data, yeah. The institution who owns the indicator, i.e. the poor people who have to go and collect this data and report on it, this is the Public Administration Reform Unit of the Ministry of Interior, and the frequency that we collect data to report on this is annual, okay? So there you go. If your indicator can have those characteristics, then you're basically sorted, all right? And as you can see, it's not that tricky, but it basically tells you everything you need to know to be able to track the performance of your issue. Okay. RACER, I'm not going to dwell on RACER. These are standards which are used by the EU to basically check whether your indicator is fit for purpose. Relevant, accepted, credible, easy, and robust. Okay. We can discuss these another time. Good. But what I'd like to do is this point was raised by Colm earlier and by Enrique, which is that the idea is that indicators at a project or contract level, or certainly for overall objectives or outcomes, should in some way be coherent with indicators in action documents, and those in turn should be coherent with those within your higher level strategic documents. And this is what the Commission is striving for.
Exactly. So this we made because of ongoing discussions in NEAR, but just to explain very, very quickly, the strategic documents which guide EU assistance to Georgia, that's the SSF. We'll set that aside for the moment, but obviously the action document, which is the work essentially of the delegation and the geographical headquarters, that has to be some of your indicators must be, your logic has to be coherent with the SSF, and some of your indicators have to be coherent with it and have to be drawn from this list which you're going to receive. So I just indicatively put in a few numbers, imaginary, for some indicators that might say be drawn from that list. Others might not. Now, when you get to the contract level, which is the level of the partners in the room here, their contracts with the EU, what's been talked about here very clear is that some, not all, not even most, but some of your indicators would also need to be drawn from the action document, and consistent then with the higher level. So if you look at the contract and you look at output 12 or outcome 11, you could see that if that's in contract X and it's been measured in contract X, then that can feed into the same indicator in the action document, which in turn can then be feeding into the overall results framework used by DG NEAR. That is the logic. That's what's been talked about. And critically, what we're talking about is using these indicators in identical form. In other words, not changing them, because that can lead to problems. Now, PQR, if you look at that, and AB and all of that, that's simply recognizing that in addition to a couple of indicators drawn from the EU, the implementing partner may well propose other indicators, more important and so on, which it finds more appropriate to the particular intervention. That's what we're talking about. That's the direction of travel. Okay? Thank you.
Great. Now we need to do some exercises. Because time is against us, I suggest we try to spend 30 minutes. Yeah. And what we'll do is we've got a series of examples of indicators which have been taken from some documents. They are not identical. They've been adjusted a little bit, again, to illustrate some of the learning points which we've got. Yeah. And what we'd like you to do is, each one of us, you'll be split into groups, and we'll just take you through these examples. We've got impact indicators, we've got some outcome indicators, and we've got some output indicators. I suspect we'll need to just take one example from impact, one example from outcome, and one example from output. Yeah, and we'll just try and critique them and get some feedback from you. And then if we can come back, if we can convene at 10:27 or just before 10:30, then we'll just have a very quick feedback session, and then we'll be done. Okay? So Albert, can you split us into our groups, please? I would ask you if you've got any questions, but if we've got questions, can we ask them in the group session?